G'day folks, ZiggyD here, and in this video I'm going to go over nearly all of the card effect keywords and a few key game mechanics in Monster Train. Now there's no substitute for playing the mechanics yourself and seeing them in action, but this should help answer some of your questions and help you come up with some new strategies. Now before we get too into it, I want to explain the difference between turns and combat and the Relentless mechanic in this game, because it's really important for understanding how a lot of other things trigger. So in Monster Train, after cards have been used and you click the end turn button, combat begins and each creature that can do so will make an attack. When all attacks have been made, combat and the turn is complete, normally. Against normal enemies, combat lasts one turn, and any surviving enemies will move on up to the next floor. It changes, however, with bosses, as they have the Relentless keyword, and combat will continue until either all of your creatures on the floor are dead, or until the boss actually dies. Now, combat against bosses can last multiple turns, and a turn ends when all attacks on both sides have been made. Now, this is really important because effects that decay or trigger at the end of a turn trigger each turn in that combat. So things like Regen will trigger each turn after all of the attacks have been made by the boss and your creatures, and Rage and things like that will decay at the end of each of that turn. It's pretty important to know this because it means that effects like Regen will take effect during a boss combat, as multiple turns will occur over the course of that combat, but also things like Rage will get weaker and weaker the longer the combat drags on. So now we're going to start going through various keywords in rough order of clans, but there is a fair bit of overlap between keywords. Some of them are global, you'll see across all of the clans, and others will overlap a little bit and have impacts on multiple clans. So firstly, consume on Spike of the Hellhorn. These are single-use cards per encounter. They'll stay in your deck, however they go on for the rest of the encounter after you use them once. There are, however, ways of bringing back consume cards, like, for example, on Impish Scholar over here, which returns a random consumed spell to your hand. Another thing that can help you use consume multiple times in an encounter is wing clippings, which has a 50% chance for a consume card to be discarded instead of consumed. X cost cards, like here on Vent, consume all of your remaining amber to do some sort of scaling effect. In this case, damage 2 times the amount that you spend. These effects can sometimes be very powerful, and the first Hell Pact artifact adds +3 to the X value of the card. What this means is you can actually play X cost cards with this artifact for 0 Ember and still get 3 effect value on the actual playing of the card. Rage is primarily a Hellhorned mechanic, though you can see it in other places and apply it to creatures from other clans. Rage applies 2 extra damage per stack to the creature, and it decays by 1 every turn. Multistrike works really well with Rage because you get the bonus damage per attack made with the Multistrike. Many effects can increase or add Rage mechanics, and some effects can actually scale it as well, making it more powerful. Like, for example, the Deranged Brute, who adds an additional 2+ damage per stack of Rage. So this would make 10 Rage do 40 damage instead of 20 extra damage. Armor is a mechanic you'll see across many different clans. It's effectively just an extra life pool on top of your other life pool. Each point of armor mitigates 1 point of damage. Armor can't be healed like life can be, but it can be added to and scaled in various ways. The piercing mechanic ignores armor. On that note, the piercing mechanic ignores both armor and also damage and spell shields, making things like Hornbreak a very powerful effect, especially if you add scaling to them. The ascend and descend keywords, respectively, either move a creature up a floor or down a floor if it's descend. You can do this to both your own creatures and enemy creatures. An important thing to note is that it always moves the creature to the back or rearmost rank if there's already creatures on the floor that you move it to. The Dazed mechanic makes the unit skip its next attack. 1 attack is missed per stack. Tiresome Climb, for example, can actually be used to ascend a unit to the pyre room, dazing it so that the pyre can kill it safely. Summon effects are fairly straightforward. They trigger when you summon the actual creature. You see this a lot on Imps in the Hellhorn clan. Transcend Imp is a particularly powerful card that will actually replay all previous summon effects triggered that battle. Multistrike, as the name implies, causes a creature to hit multiple times in succession. Each stack of Multistrike adds 1 more attack that occurs right after the previous one. It can be stacked a bunch of times, and it's very powerful for scaling on hit effects and added damage. So if you were to add +10 damage to the Hornbreaker Prince here with Multistrike 2, instead of adding 10 damage like it would to a normal creature, it would actually add 30 damage because you're hitting 3 times. You're applying that +10 damage 3 times. Multistrike's biggest weakness is enemies with spikes, as they'll reflect their damage for each hit. On that note, let's take a look at spikes. When a creature with spikes is attacked, damage is returned, 1 damage per stack. Many effects can add spikes or scale its effect. The Petrified Crucible artifact, for example, adds an extra point of damage per spike stack, so 10 spikes would return 20 damage instead of 10. Spikes can also be leveraged in other ways, such as with the Bramble Lash spell that deals 10 times the amount of spikes on friendly units on that floor to an enemy. In a spikes build, this spell can be a boss one-shotter. Strike effects, like on Alpha Fiend here, just trigger the listed effect when the creature hits something with an attack. This scales really well with Multistrike, as each hit triggers the strike effect, so he'll gain it multiple times. Enhance effects, like on Channel Song here, provide some sort of listed buff to the creature for the remainder of the battle. It's important to note that Enhance cannot be double stacked. On that note, Doublestack is a mechanic that you can purchase via the upgrade stores for spells, and it doubles the buff or debuff supplied by a spell card, so long as it's something that can stack, so something numerical. Examples include things like Rage, Armor, or Spikes, but not Enhance effects. Regen heals a point of health per regen stack, and then at the end of the turn, regen decays by 1 point. Regen can be added in many ways and scaled by things, like for example the Bloating Fungus, which adds an extra health point restored per regen stack, so effectively doubling its effect if it's the only scaling that you have. Regen can also trigger Rejuvenate procs, even if the creature is at full health, which is important to note. And on that note, Rejuvenate is a keyword that triggers a listed effect whenever the creature is healed, so this counts with direct healing, but also regen triggers. For example, if on Awoken Hollow, you use the Restore spell, it'll trigger the Rejuvenate effect twice. Once when you apply the spell its first time because it restores 2 health, and then once at the end of the turn since the regen will also trigger. This makes the basic Restore spell surprisingly valuable for things that have Rejuvenate triggers. Rooted, like on Ensnare here, prevents a unit from ascending to the next floor when combat is complete. It does not work on bosses. Sweep, like on the Husk Hermit here, a staple creature for the Awoken clan, makes its attack hit all creatures effectively in AoE. Sweeper units are really good for dealing with backline squishy creatures and for applying status effects on all creatures. Sweepers generally benefit a lot from upgrades that add damage. Now, normally the enemy attacks first in Monster Train. With Quick, however, like you see on the Animus of Speed, and which can be applied to creatures through some spells and card upgrades, allows your creature to attack before the enemies. This can be useful for killing a creature or applying an attack effect before the enemy can attack you back. It's particularly potent on high damage but low health creatures, and Animus of Speed is a great example of that. Typically, a squishy creature like this would have a difficult time defending itself because once it gets hit, it dies and it wouldn't attack back, but with Quick, it has a chance to kill the creature that would kill it before it has a chance. Resolve, like on the Vine Mother here, triggers the listed effect at the end of combat. It's important to note combat and not the turn, because it means that it's helpful for regular encounters and earlier on in an engagement, but it's not helpful for the boss encounters. Resolve creatures can be particularly powerful if they're placed nice and early in an encounter and well protected for the entirety of that encounter. Sap, like on the Guardian's Amulet here, is the opposite of Rage. It lowers a creature's damage by 2 per stack, and it decays by 1 stack each round. It is very powerful when stacked on a boss. Frostbite, like on Crystalline Seeds here, deals damage to the creature at the end of each turn, 1 damage per stack, and it decays 1 stack per turn. It can be added to creatures and scaled in many ways. The Cuddlebeard artifact, for example, adds 2 stacks of Frostbite each time it's applied and stops Frostbite from decaying. Frostbite is best applied in the lower floors so that it has more turns to actually damage the enemy. If you apply it on the final floor before the pyre, it effectively only has like a little bit of time to actually act and kill the enemy. Stalling a boss with a tanky creature or with effects like Sap or Regen can allow time for the Frostbite to kill the boss. If you're playing a Frostbite deck, it's important to know about Hoarfrost Effigy, as it's one of the more powerful cards for this, as it transfers all Frostbite to the creature and then doubles the amount, particularly impactful on bosses. Spell Weakness is another very powerful effect, like for example on Energy Siphon here. It makes creatures take more damage from direct damage dealing spells, but not from debuff effects like Frostbite. 1 stack of Spell Weakness doubles the damage taken, 2 stacks triples it, 3 stacks quadruples it, and so on. When a damage-dealing spell hits a creature with Spell Weakness, all stacks of Spell Weakness are removed. So it's best to carefully use your highest damage spell on a creature with spell weakness, rather than wasting it on a low damage spell. It's very powerful in spell damage decks, especially if stacked many times on a boss over the course of the battle, especially for bosses that fly on the edge of the arena. If you want to do thousands of damage with a single spell, then spell weakness is the way to do it. Permafrost applies Frozen to a card when it's first drawn, and Frozen cards will stay in your hand and won't be discarded until the end of the turn or until you play the card. This is very useful for cards that require precise timing. So if you want to set up a combo, then having Frozen on a card or applying Permafrost to it can be very handy. Silence disables any triggered effects on creatures. It doesn't remove current buffs, but it'll prevent future buffs from being added or future negative things from occurring, particularly good for things like enemies with Incanct. And on that note, Incanct effects are triggered when a spell is cast on that same floor. Spamming low-cost spells is a good way to trigger Incanct on friendly creatures like Guardian Stone to apply armor to everything. You can cast your spells on a different floor, like for example the Pyre Room, to avoid enemy Incants, as long as the spell doesn't need a target. Pyrebound cards can only be played in the Pyre Room or the floor below it. Typically these are last-ditch efforts. Revenge effects, like on the Titan Sentry here, are triggered when any damage is dealt to the creature. You can trigger a revenge effect with your own damage dealing spells, which can sometimes be worth it. Cards with Offering are played for free when discarded before you click End Turn. This is particularly good with Offering Token, which allows you to manually choose a card to discard. Offering spells also work particularly well with Permafrost or Frozen, because it allows you to retain them in hand until such time as you can discard it. One of the most powerful combos in the game actually might be using a very small deck with Guardian's Amulet and Offering Token to discard multiple Guardian Amulets per turn to apply sap to a boss. Getting something like 50 or 100 stacks of sap on a boss will mean that you can kill it at your own leisure. Damage Shields, which can be applied to creatures through things like Prismal Dust, blocks a single instance of damage, all of that damage. Each damage shield stack will block one instance of damage. It's really powerful against high damage enemies, but much less powerful against low damage swarms of creatures or against multi-strikers. Now that we're kind of getting into Umbra, it's pretty important to talk about Morsels and the Eaten mechanic. So Morsels are specific creatures in the Umbra deck. These creatures are eaten at the end of the turn by the front or rightmost creature that isn't a morsel itself. Now, if there is no creature there that is viable to eat the morsels will stay there and not be eaten. Morsels can also be manually triggered to be eaten earlier than the end of combat by things like Feast or Shroud Spike. There are many different morsel types that each provide different effects when they are eaten. Some of them are focused on, well, most of them are focused on directly buffing the creature itself, but some of them are also about things like gaining energy. There are 3 different rarities of morsels: common, uncommon, and rare. Typically, it just means whether they're stronger or weaker. Like, for example, Antumbra and Magma are common, and Morsel Miner is a rare one. There are a bunch of different ways to summon morsel creatures, like things like Packed Morsel, Cannibalize, which sacrifices a creature and summons 3 random uncommon or rares, and multiple other effects from artifacts and spells. Gorge is a very related mechanic. It appears on non-morsel Umbra creatures and applies that listed bonus whenever the creature specifically eats a morsel. So this creature has to eat the morsel, not someone else. This can trigger multiple times if multiple morsels are eaten. Overgorger is a very powerful example of a Gorge creature because he gains 2+ damage permanently, that means across all of battles, each time he eats a morsel. You can effectively create a deck which focuses on feeding an Overgorger as much as possible across multiple encounters before deploying him as your boss killer in some of the final battles. Lifesteal makes it so that attack damage heals health equal to the damage dealt by the creature. 1 stack of Lifesteal is lost after each attack is made. Emberdrain, like the second effect listed here on Perils of Production, is a negative effect that lowers your Ember, the game's mana system, at the beginning of the next turn. Each stack of Emberdrain drains 1 Ember, and Emberdrain will decay by 1 stack each turn. Usually this is a drawback to a powerful buff spell, but it can be played around with effects that allow you to gain Ember after a turn has begun. Now that we're looking at Umbra, it's a pretty good time to mention floor capacity. Each floor starts with 5 capacity by default, and creatures take various amounts of capacity based on the circles listed above their portraits. So you can see 1 circle for a Morsel, 2 circles for a Crucible Warden, and 4 circles for an Emberforge. Multiple things can increase or decrease floor capacity, such as Space Prism increasing it by 1. And builds with larger creatures like Amber Forgers, or that swarm a bunch of smaller creatures like Morsels, may need to invest in some way of increasing floor capacity. Trample will make it so that a creature will apply any damage that is excess to killing the first attacked enemy to the creature behind it. This is useful on creatures that have very large single attacks. The Umbra Stone card here can apply Trample to a specified creature, and some creatures and champions will have it as well. Now we're getting into the Melting Remnant, and we'll take a look at Burnout. Some Melting Remnant cards have Burnout, which is effectively a countdown timer until they die. It counts down by 1 each turn, and once it reaches 0, the creature dies. Now Burnout timers can be effectively increased by adding more stacks of Burnout to a Burnout creature. Creatures that don't already have Burnout can have Burnout applied to them, and then they'll die when it runs out. Burnout can be a positive or a negative thing depending on the creature in the deck. In some cases, you actually want your creatures to die, especially with Melting Remnant. Extinguish effects trigger when a unit dies, and it can work really well with Reform, which we'll get into in a second. The Bounty Stalker is a particularly strong Extinguish creature, as each time it dies, it gets 10 more damage permanently. So you can kill it a lot of times, bring it back and kill it again, and then in later battles it'll end up doing a lot of damage. And on that note, a huge mechanic for the Melting Remnant clan is Reform. Reform brings a dead unit back to your hand, giving them +5 damage and life, 0 amber cost, and Burnout 1. For creatures that don't have Burnout, this means they'll die in 1 turn unless you add more stacks that turn. For creatures that already have Burnout, like for example the Draft here which has Burnout 1, it adds a stack which means it'll actually last longer when reformed than the first time it was summoned. Units can be reformed over and over in an encounter, which is a viable way of growing them in size and power. The stealth mechanic, like again on this Bounty Stalker here, means that the creature is ignored by attacks for 1 combat turn. Stealth decays by 1 stack each turn, so the Bounty Stalker will effectively be missed 1 turn. Harvest, like found on the very dapper Wickless Tycoon, triggers the listed effect when a creature dies on the floor. This can be allied or enemy creatures. It works really well paired with the Umbra clan Morsels, since they can be spammed in large numbers and die every turn when they're eaten. And that, yes, means a lot of gold with Wickless Tycoon setups. Now normally when units are played, they are removed from your deck for the rest of that encounter. Endless adds the unit back to the top of your draw pile when the unit dies. This runs counter to the idea of reforming, as you cannot reform an Endless unit. Endless can be applied via upgrades in the creature shop, and it's particularly good on the Imps from Hellhorn. Now I just want to quickly go over the actual card types, as this is relevant in some cases. Creatures are listed by their race or type, like for example Demon or Waxer or Machine, like the Legion of Wax here is a Waxer. All of these that are listed like this are creatures. So Wickless over here, Tomb, these are all creatures. Some effects will care about creature race, like for example an artifact that gives demons multi-strike, or a thing that gives Tomb creatures more health. Pretty much every other normal card is a spell, and they're all listed as such down the bottom here. Blight cards, like Deadweight, are added to your deck by Ice Cavern encounters and by Covenant rank drawbacks. Mostly these are dead or negative cards in your deck that have some sort of drawback. The drawback can just be the fact that it's in your deck and is not another better card. However, there are sometimes some encounters in the Ice Caverns that can twist the idea of having Blight cards in your deck into some form of positive. Scourge cards are negative cards that are added by bosses and enemy creatures during combat. They only remain in your deck for that encounter. Usually they do something bad unless you play them. Like for example Self-Mutilation doing fire damage to your pyre unless you play it. A bit of a note on champion upgrades. These are applied via the Dark Forge, and you can choose one of them at the beginning of each run. You'll randomly be given a choice of 2 of the 3 different types. Over the course of a run, you'll get 3 opportunities to use the Dark Forge. As you can see, there's 3 ranks of each type of upgrade, and you can actually combine any 2 of these type over the course of a run. So you could get 1 stack in Dark Calling, and then 2 stacks in Accumulator. Another great example would be to get like Multistrike 1 from Brawler, and then 2 stacks in Wrathful. Sometimes a combination of Dark Forge upgrades can be stronger than just sticking with one particular Dark Forge path. Anyway folks, I know this is a bit of a longer video, and I know that is a lot to go over, but I hope you found this helpful and it answered some of your questions or gave you some insights into the game. That's it for now, I'm ZiggyD, and thanks for watching.